Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo Burya and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
Well, we're continuing our China series today. Most recently, we were talking about their space program as well as their other technological advancements. And before that, of course, we did an episode on Xi Jinping and his power base in China. And today, let's start by talking about Alibaba. You wrote a great Bismarck brief on the company and how it went from revolutionary to incumbent. Why don't you start by giving some of the backstory behind why you decided to do that and what were some of the biggest things you uncovered in the piece?
What I was most interested in is what happened to the company after the de facto departure of Jack Ma. Jack Ma was a great example of an innovative and honestly adaptive Chinese entrepreneur. He was pretty much a classic example of an economic live player, and he had very strongly held opinions also about how the Chinese financial sector should operate. Now, of course, he wasn't disinterested in these, honestly, at the end of the day, still economic and technocratic critiques of the CCP. He had an important stake. Alibaba and the closely related Ant Group have, maintained the Alipay mobile payment app, which has over 1.3 billion users. So that's approximately the population of China and approximately 1 in every 6 people alive today. It forms part of the backbone of China's economy. Online shopping in China accounts for 27% of retail. Over half of that is sold through Alibaba. So this means they have 1/8 of all of China's retail sales. And clearly, this is an absolutely massive market. So because of this, what kind of financial services could be offered on the Ant Group platform was in Jack Ma's pretty direct, economic, personal interest. But at the end of the day, it also gives them a significant amount of insight into the Chinese economy. One of the more interesting critiques that I read in one of the few sort of translated pieces that you can find from China's, Communist Party journals, which, by the way, for the general public, these, while they are publicly available in Chinese, the translations that are officially provided by the Chinese government are sparse and often different in important key points. So anyway, in one of the journals where a Western translator had gone through and has looked at the material, someone made a relatively important point. This wasn't a very senior communist official, but they were sort of a respected academic. The argument they made is that Alibaba and Ant Group together just have too much information about the economy that they're not disclosing to the CCP. They have still a very Marxist logic where they want to understand in quantitative ways how the economy is performing. And I was really struck by that because that's a rather deep point. If I were to think about the state of America's consumer economy, would I rather work with a group of 20 Amazon engineers with unlimited access to Amazon's information with regard to who is purchasing what? Or would I rather work with 20 Fed economists? It's not an easy question. I think the fact that it's not overwhelmingly the Fed economists and that the Amazon engineers hypothetically seem to have, a shot at it, I think that already shows a lot about how much of this information that is basically gathered by large retailers in the modern digital economy is not just useful for, optimizing sales, providing the most value. It actually could inform government as well. So whatever the case, Alibaba is now a much more converged company. Jack Ma only has a symbolic role in running it. He has made appearances again in public. He is not imprisoned. He has also not quite been expropriated, though there has been a transfer of ownership and greater CCP presence in the company itself. In China, it's usually mandated that at various levels of a company, sometimes if there's a state interest on the board, other times just in the normal operations of the company, basically representatives from the Chinese Communist Party are involved in decision making. For what it's worth, I don't think they picked up on the economic planning aspect of something like Alibaba. However, they did prevent an independent voice speaking about the Chinese economy, someone that actually would have independent figures. In China, any sort of political figure, any sort of economic figure is also a political figure, because economic growth is straightforwardly, this provenance of the CCP and directly tied to its legitimacy. But to go back to Alibaba, it's in many ways very similar, again, to not just Amazon, but to Google and Microsoft. It doesn't have a single product. It's a vast conglomerate with many different projects. Even the comparison of calling it China's Amazon, as is very common in the media, is a little bit misleading, since it came to be at around the same time as Amazon was. It's not a copycat company, right? It's not copying an already established model. It built its e-commerce model at about the same pace that Amazon did, in about the same era that Amazon did. And in some innovations, it was faster than Amazon. Among its many ventures also, and part of the reason why Jack Ma briefly seemed such a significant threat, was also a movie studio, Alibaba Pictures. They also had the video streaming website Youku, the Hong Kong newspaper, the South China Morning Post, and many more. So at the end of the day, this was a company that was already embedded also in China's media landscape and could have, again, that independent information on the economy and to some extent, well, not independent, but at least like altered or somewhat autonomous perspective to talk about the state of the economy and what should be done. So still, as often happens with software conglomerates, with large-scale tech companies, one sector dominates revenue. Unsurprisingly, retail commerce in China, mainland China, accounts for 67% of Alibaba's revenue. So at the end of the day, while a complicated company with many components, many structures, including things like food delivery service like Elle.me, it's really just the retail that pays the bills, which is in an interesting contrast with Amazon, who has since come to more and more rely on Amazon Web Services and try to get revenues there. Still, in the fiscal year of 2022, Alibaba reported $135 billion of revenue. So when we say that, and when I've said at previous podcasts that China's software sector is comparable to the US software sector, Alibaba is a great example of that. When you see these numbers, when you're talking about 1.3 billion users and $135 billion of revenue, of course, it isn't quite comparable to Amazon's $514 billion of revenue, but it's not an order of magnitude away, right? It's half a magnitude away. It's like a factor of 4. And you look at company after company, it's very similar, right? You have other Chinese companies that are such giants like Tencent and Baidu and so on. One way to think about it is that, Ant Group and Alibaba together constitute something like PayPal plus Amazon plus Walmart for China. And that in itself is sort of this backbone of the consumer economy that the government under Xi Jinping has been trying to bolster. So in a weird way, something being a strategic and economic priority, something being absolutely necessary to political security for the CCP versus any sort of criticism or delegitimization, that actually resulted in being ran worse. There's no way around it. I think this is a very successful company. and will remain a very successful company. But without Jack Ma, there's no way a live player can take charge of it. And there's no way anyone inside the CCP actually has the kind of expertise necessary to kind of run this consumer economy. Now, again, it is a very centralized, so this isn't quite a free market critique. It's more like the businessman that grew the company from humble beginnings all the way to dominating, half of online retail in China. There's just practical knowledge there, tacit knowledge, and organizational wisdom that no CCP appointee could hope to match because they're training a totally different skill set, right? So even though it's a private sort of software giant, I think they could actually interface and provide needs for the Chinese economy in the way that will be difficult to do in the future. Now, earlier I said that Alibaba out-innovated Amazon. I think that's literally true in the following sense as well. Amazon and Alibaba were actually competitors in China. And at that point, the Chinese government was not quite as brazen as it is today in favoring Chinese companies. So when we think of a software giant like Baidu, well, if you ban Google, of course there's going to be a Chinese Google, right? There's going to be a Chinese company providing that. But the Chinese government, while it has banned Google, Wikipedia, Facebook, Twitter over the years, it never banned, it didn't ban Amazon in the crucial period. It's still not banned, actually. Its operations, Amazon's operations, do not present an ideological threat. So unlike when it comes to a source of information like Wikipedia, a source of news, or potentially even organization of an uprising, like say Twitter or Facebook could be, Amazon was just this almost technical service that they saw no problem with. Basically, Amazon operated in China as late as 2019, but it shut down due to poor financial performance, not due to a government decision. I think 2019, it was still this era when the last gasp of globalization, as we understood it in the 2010s, was playing out. So almost on the eve of COVID-19 as well, right? And that was, of course, the era when the Chinese economy took the greatest hit in terms of consumption that it's had in honestly decades. So basically, one of the few, and it's not just, why am I bringing up this like sort of wave of 2010 globalization? In the Western world, in major companies, 2015, 2016, maybe as late as 2018, a little bit in 2019 for some of the companies that were most invested, the view was we just have to comply with Chinese laws. And if we can do business in China, we are actually doing our part in liberalizing China. We don't need to fight their censorship. We can comply with their censorship. And as long as we do business in China, we're helping make China a free market economy. And that's going to eventually ensure in it liberalizing. As China becomes wealthier, it'll become a democracy. This wasn't just government policy. Many businessmen who were hoping to make money, many companies that were hoping to make money in China believe this. And this was also sort of the internal story. We just have to comply. We have a foothold in this market. Later on, these restrictions are going to be lifted, or even they would argue the restrictions weren't quite as bad as Western media might portray them as, right? You have these corporate memos where people are comparing in the same breath Chinese limitations on free speech, not with US free speech, which is honestly, the best in the world, but to say European speech laws. So there's also this like interesting dichotomy where even if the laws in say the EU or EU countries on matters of speech are applied much more sparingly than they are in China, the very fact they exist allow companies that, when they comply with the EU from a bureaucratic perspective, there's no reason not to also comply with the CCP. There might be a moral reason, but there's no like rule that you are, following when you comply with EU regulations on speech or the individual member states regulation on speech. There's no rule that you're following then that you're not also following when you comply with China's limitations. I found it kind of funny that the customer reviews on Amazon of Xi Jinping's book series, The Governance of China, were apparently censored and modified. So it's sort of like, it's kind of funny. When you're running a country, you get to juice your Amazon book reviews. Talk about a captive audience, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot there that I want to jump.
Also, just to add one more small point, I said Amazon closed retail, but Amazon Web Services actually still operates in China. And, Chinese products and exports Chinese products to Amazon customers overseas. So Amazon actually has still a foothold in the Chinese economy to this day.
That's interesting.
We'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search, Brave offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention MOZ when signing up for a 25% discount on your first campaign.
So the Jack Ma effect, do you think that, to what extent did that reduce the potential of future Jack Ma's? Did that send sort of a chilling effect of future entrepreneurs saying, hey, what's the point? Even if I get very successful, or talk more about the effect that the Jack Ma incident had on China. And also, is it just a massive mistake from everyone involved, from Jack Ma himself to Xi Jinping? Like, did no one win in that scenario? And if it could be taken back, it would have by everybody.
I mean, the interesting thing here is that I'm not sure if Jack thinks he's wrong. I think he would say that, look, I wasn't even challenging the way we're doing government in China. I was just right and you were just wrong. Live players are often very strong personalities. Now, of course, practically constrained, it was probably made clear to him that this would not be behavior that they will tolerate. So I think he probably feels overpowered. I don't think he's changed his mind. I think he thinks the party is wrong. On the party side, from their perspective, they've had way worse economic woes dealing with COVID-19 and its consequence. So a minor hit to the development of the online economy, it's not a big deal. Objectively speaking, though, I do think this has slowed innovation in the Chinese economy overall. The heights where one could reform large chunks of the economy, there's been a clear ceiling made. There, for example, will never be a Chinese SpaceX, because to have one company outcompete and remain privately run while controlling this big strategic sector, that just wouldn't be allowed in China. And I think before Jack Ma got in trouble, the possibility existed that you could have software-driven disruption and then software empowered innovation in the manufacturing sector in China. There are actually all sorts of very good reasons and arguments for this. Why would you want to digitalize an economy? Well, you can. It is a precondition for both automation and artificial intelligence. So unless you make your factory smart, unless you disrupt old business models, your demand for labor will remain high. And the extreme capital concentrations that software enables, because honestly, software is like probably the best business in the world, right? With the best margins. Like if you have to choose between being Google and Saudi Aramco, I would choose to be Google. The oil is going to run out someday, right? The ad revenue probably is never going to dry up unless people stop using search, which sure could happen, but arguably Google could easily, pivot with Gemini, et cetera, to other modes of serving information. So, in theory, companies like Google have so much capital that they don't know what to invest it in, and the people running them are super ambitious when they're run by a founder, right? You could have an Elon Musk maneuver where just a private individual goes and invests this basically vast software accumulation of capital into upgrading a sector of the economy where they perceive that there's an obsolescence. And if you have to or can only do this without stepping on the toes of Communist Party officials, you're not going to do it. The risk is too high. China's just too complicated. Like when you go to DC, one of the biggest questions is who's in charge of this country? And in a way, the worst answer is nobody. And while Xi Jinping is sort of like emblem and ultimate, symbol, kind of a Sun King persona, the Chinese state is so vast that if you go to Beijing, you don't know who's in charge. Unless you're lucky enough to personally meet with Xi and he gives you certain assurances, you really don't know what you're dealing with, especially if you're from Shanghai, especially if you're from a regional center in China, right? That you actually won't have this local knowledge. Just to make explicit, Alibaba is headquartered in Hangzhou in Zhejiang province, so that's in coastal China. It's not anywhere near really Beijing. It's not a Beijing company, at least not properly. Some of them are. And when you think about, the big four Chinese internet billionaires, Jack Ma, and then the Tencent founder, Pony Ma, and, Pindu founder, Colin Huang, and Wang Jing, they at one point were valued at about $73 billion. If I'd have to guess now, it's probably like $110 billion. These were billionaires that were sort of breaking out of this middle range into the high range of 100 billion or 200 billion, where possibly you could, as an individual, choose to allocate that amount of capital to just reforming whole industries, right? And China, unlike the United States, is still producing half of the world's stuff. So there would certainly be very profitable opportunities for investment. And some of the stuff, of course, was produced in Shenzhen and in China's Silicon Valley. So the ecosystem is both. There's a software ecosystem, a hardware ecosystem, and stuff that's totally unrelated to tech that's just built in this like massive river delta region. Pony Ma, I think Tencent's Pony Ma is sort of the contrast example. He joined the Communist Party in a literal sense, became a member, right? And he's very careful never to critique, and he is careful to basically participate. So he is also, as a personality, a contrast to Jack Ma. He doesn't show off, right? There's no confusion as to whether he as a businessman could be as influential in Chinese public life or Chinese political life as an official. And at the end of the day, that means that, first off, he's not going to quite be allowed to accumulate as much money as an unencumbered Elon Musk or Bezos might be in the Western world. So he can allocate less. Second, his position will be defended to some extent. He will, basically retain control of the company. But he won't be really able to be a live player when it comes to disrupting or correcting for government policy. And I think this sort of chilling effect is not visible when it comes to small startups, right? So I don't think we will have fewer Chinese tech companies. I do think it is very deeply a chilling effect for any founder controlled, successful, large software company. So, in other words, by pushing away Jack Ma, the CCP has decided that they will not have economic live players at the highest level who climbed out of the internet economy. They correctly noticed that we're still going to have internet companies, we're still going to have AI companies, etc., but we're not going to allow them to, pursue a digital revolution in the economy. Um, I honestly think that that's a shame for the world, not just for China, because Western tech entrepreneurs, even at this big level of this, like actually when you can throw $10 million or $10 billion or $50 billion into an investment or an acquisition, right? Even people at that level, they really struggle finding manufacturing that's worth doing in the United States or in Europe. And China was this one place in the world where we might have seen the full potential of the information revolution. I think we have not yet seen, there's the Mark Andreessen line of, software's eating the world. We've not really seen software applied to produce, we've not yet seen bits put to work in making atoms. We've not yet seen unleashed the full power of software disruption in just normal manufacturing. I'm not even talking AI here. I'm just talking about gather information in the factory, process it as you would big data, have sensors, have basic programmable automation, have rapid prototyping. How far can you push this? I think it could have been pushed much farther. And, to some extent, we're not going to see this because big atoms companies are bad at bits. And big bits companies, in China at least, will not be allowed to displace big atoms companies. So that's, I think, the take. There was by pushing down Jack Ma, China has sacrificed the possibility of an actual union of bits and atoms.
Hmm. And they won't be allowed by not having founders, or they won't be like in an indirect way by not having founder controlled companies, or in a direct way that they just literally won't let them get that big, or won't let them.
I think in a pretty direct way. I think, again, the founders will go into making online companies. Like Eric, no one says no to becoming a billionaire. You can still be a billionaire in China, though it might be difficult. You'll still get to produce software innovation. You will not get to mess with any national champion style company, right? You won't get to mess with a company that is party adjacent. So you'll just be always kept out by the more connected companies, many of which are headquartered in Beijing. So maybe one analogy would be if Washington D.C. systematically favored, I don't know, Ford over Tesla. I mean, oops, it does a little bit, of course, right? Because at the very least, there are more union jobs, etc., all of that stuff. Um, but for the most part, in the U.S., big companies, like companies that are Silicon Valley companies, if they choose to, are allowed to compete with the old giants of American industry. And I think in China, those giants of Chinese industry, these are younger companies, but I don't think software will be allowed to compete with them because software is just less connected than some of those companies.
Yeah. And so, what is the benefit? Is the benefit just like you've outlined the costs, or why this is a shame, not just
Yeah.
for China but for the rest of the world? Is it net positive? They have to believe it's net positive, otherwise they wouldn't be doing this. Articulate the counter, the why this makes sense for them, or does it just not make sense even on their own sort of
Mhm.
logic?
Well, in China, the Overton window on what's publicly tolerated policy discourse has narrowed significantly over the last 8 years. Um, basically, the sort of praise of the party from business leaders is like ever greater. Any sort of reservations on economic policy it's sort of not something you're even supposed to say. I think the reason is the CCP was concerned about losing political control of the country. And their argument would be that political control by the CCP is necessary. So if I outline this case, they would point to Chinese history and say that every single time a dynasty has ended, there's been a period of severe political instability, sometimes resulting in a full on fragmentation and some of the bloodiest wars in human history. Some of the bloodiest wars in human history were not world wars, they were Chinese rebellions, right? If you look at things like the 19th century, Taiping rebellion and so on, 20, 30 million dead. Or if you look at the Chinese warlord era at the start of the 20th century, totally a fragmented China with each fragment sort of claiming legitimacy to the whole thing, fighting each other all the way until the Japanese invade from the outside. Basically during World War II, a temporary truce to push them out, and then after World War II, again, a full-on civil war between the communist North and the nationalist South. They would propose that in the absence of the CCP, this vast country would fragment. If it were to fragment, it would lose its economic advantages and possibly would just have immense bloodshed. And then for people like Xi as well, I think they are dedicated to their ideology, and they personally feel, because they're old enough to have lived to see it, so people in their 60s, their 70s, right? They're old enough to have seen the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So they believe that it's extremely important that the party maintain the belief among its members in its right to rule, essentially. Because if you don't believe in your right to rule, well, if there are student protests, such as in Tiananmen Square, you don't send the tanks in, and then maybe actually that's the end of your regime, right? So this focus on retaining control is internally justified as necessary for eventually achieving what I do think they aim to achieve, like a proper socialist or communist society. And the more historicist argument is, even if you don't believe that we're going to build universal material abundance in this very like communist mindset way, you still might believe that the country will be absolutely wrecked by any transition out of power. And again, in their mind, the end of communism, well, it might just be like Russia in the 1990s. There are strong reasons to think that it could be done differently or that it could differ by a great degree, but they won't be inclined to think that way. So for them, this is politically existential, and the politically existential is basically a matter of national security.
Got it. So some reduced dynamism in favor of stability, which will then, protect the dynamism it at least has,
Yeah, and also they're struggling to actually figure out what the role of the party is in a developed economy. They had this model where basically they could get legitimacy out of economic growth, which honestly is easy. Almost any regime can do that if you secure economic growth, which is less easy. But as growth has slowed, they've really struggled to figure out what to do. And I think control of public discourse, basically ideological conformity of leaders, preventing the creation of counter elites, this sort of secures the political economy. If they had a better idea of what to do, I think they would pursue it. But I don't think they know what to do. They don't have a next stage in development. I've often spoken favorably about Chinese innovation in technology, including Chinese incremental innovation in production. But when it comes to their vision, the government has no vision of a uniquely Chinese civilization. They have no vision for what the future looks like, except that you copy whatever the US is doing economically, you copy whatever the US is doing technologically, You match military capabilities. You don't bother controlling a world-spanning empire. So in their thinking, it's actually a weakness of the U.S. that it has all of these international entanglements, and they're sort of trying to minimize their military obligations around the world. And they are basically expecting that as long as they run this essentially Western model, but with a single party state, eventually the Western democracies will, become irrelevant, become economically incapable of pursuing or supporting their values within China, and perhaps will come to eventually emulate the Chinese system. And really, if they had an alternate vision of development, they wouldn't need to resort to essentially oppression as the means to achieve the persistence of party power in China. But they have no vision, so the oppression is all they have. So if you're an official, what are you even going to do, right? This is also, by the way, the reason that I think some of the more hawkish statements that you see by junior Chinese diplomatic officials are, again, a consequence of a lack of vision. They don't really know what their job is as a Chinese diplomat. It's not very clear. It's like, okay, do business with the world, verbally oppose US overreach, verbally affirm, but in substance undermine any international institution that the US and China are both a part of. But there's no real agenda to, I don't know, let's say, topple the Iranian government or topple the South Korean government and install a communist dictatorship. That was actual Cold War reasoning, right? Like the Soviet Union's grand strategy, in a way, was to create enough client states like Cuba and Vietnam and so on, so as to have a tactical, an operational advantage in every battlefield where they might fight the United States if it ever came to a world war. China has no hope of having an advantage in Latin America or Africa or
Well,
even
is this
Europe.
Belt and Road was hoping to do?
I think Belt and Road was hoping to produce alternate infrastructure that would help and be focused on the Chinese economy and could provide redundancies in case certain trade routes, like the Straits of Malacca, were basically embargoed. But when you look at the details of Belt and Road in, say, Pakistan, it just totally failed. Like, so much of the money went nowhere or went into basically random corrupt local contractors and officials. Like, Pakistan to this day is sort of not a viable alternate route into China, right? All of the shipping still has to go through sort of the Indian Ocean and so on. Maybe something like Thailand could work out better. Still, though, I think Belt and Road was, I think it was less China's plan to dominate the world and less China's Marshall Plan and more China trying to offshore. They have companies that are struggling to figure out what to do with their capital. It's not clear what to invest in within China. Investing in ports that are trading with you and infrastructure that's trading with you, that seemed a safe bet. The economic returns have been mediocre. And the political returns, sure, for some countries, they were significant. But on the example of Pakistan, it's not clear who exactly you bribed, right? Because the state's not even coherent enough to do so. I think that Belt and Road perhaps is more important in something like North Sudan versus South Sudan, right? Where we could simplify and say that North Sudan is sort of like, does business with Chinese oil companies, right? Sinopec, I think it's called. But outside of East Africa, it has not had much, right, impact. If you look at, say, Central Asia and the Middle East and Southeast Asia, in all of these regions, the other side has an advantage, right? There are US military bases all over Southeast Asia. And while these countries wish to continue trade with China, they obviously also wish to continue trade with the United States and Australia. Any infrastructure investment you do there, it has to a great extent been matched by, say, Japanese and South Korean investment. right? If you think about the Philippines or Vietnam, right? Like you have South Korean and Japanese firms doing business there. If you look at Central Asia, well, in Central Asia, you don't really have control over Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is sort of playing you off versus Russia. And Russia is nominally your friend, or at least, a warm acquaintance. So you don't want to mess with them too much. When you look at the Middle East, okay, empowering Iran seems a bad idea. If Putin was a wild card with his invasion of Ukraine, if you give Iran, who does ship a lot of its oil to China, if you give it any leeway or even a sense that it's a strong Chinese ally or economically too important, you're going to get into all sorts of Middle Eastern headaches that Chinese leadership just sees as actually pointless, right? From the perspective of Chinese leadership, the United States kind of fumbled the bag in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're like, well, we're not going to do the same. We're not going to have that quagmire. They might buy minerals from, say, the Taliban, but I don't think they're interested in arming the Taliban. Or, they would have been just as happy to buy minerals from a non-Taliban government. So, in other words, I think China is like expanding into areas where it's either such a fractal mess that it's really hard to get favor, or they're dealing with governments that explicitly want to balance out their interests with US interests or the interests of US allies like Japan and South Korea. So, really, the chance of, say, like a military intervention in Southeast Asia to protect Chinese economic interests, if, say, I don't know, if, say, the president of Indonesia 10 years from now decides to just nationalize all Chinese owned factories in Indonesia and China invades Indonesia, is there any scenario where this does not result in the US pushing back? So, in a way, it's like there's no easy space to practice imperialism unopposed, except again for East Africa. I could see the Belt and Road developing into like a deeper neocolonialism there. But that depends on the policy decisions they make in China.
And is it fair to say that um, sort of the hopes for Belt and Road have not been achieved thus far? And if they can go back in
Mhm.
time, they either would have done it differently or not done it?
I think that, yeah, the economic results and the diplomatic results have been disappointing. The best that has happened is sort of the details of the deal they pursued with Italy. And basically, the greatest economic benefit of Belt and Road so far has been easier trade with Europe, which of course is useless in a scenario of like a great power struggle with the United States. It's almost certain that trade stops right away. So it had modest economic returns. I think if you think of the Belt and Road as China offshoring or trying to offshore, or China trying to push globalization further because its wealth and its growth were due to US led globalization, if you measure it on that, it's a complete failure. It did not meaningfully increase how globalized these countries were. It did not make the regimes that indebted to China. Some influence, again, in Pakistan, very much so. But it's like a double edged sword. It's like, do you want to be on the hook to protect Pakistan versus India? Like, that is one of the few places where you could get into a nuclear war where only you get hurt and, say, the US or Russia do not get hurt, right? If, say, there was a war between India and Pakistan and China entered the war, India has nuclear weapons. India can retaliate. It would be a complete self own. I don't think they had a clearly better investment. I think they could have perhaps invested the same capital into pushing automation even further, which would have insulated them from their own demographic woes to some extent. They could have focused these funds more squarely on a small number of countries. Like, say, had they really pushed into making the Philippines a complete economic protectorate of China and gone as far as to say, well, the Philippines has US military bases all over it, but there are many islands. Can we have a military base too? It would be hard for the US to say have prevented that, though that, of course, would have been seen as an escalation in the region. So, again, geopolitically, it might have been a loss, even if it did expand their influence. It's sort of like, do you want to push where anytime you add more pressure, the other side mobilizes its allies further? Or do you sort of want to wait until these forces arrayed against you dissipate? South Korea and Japan, of course, are going to face a real military decline driven partially by an economic decline, but most significantly by a demographic decline faster than China is. So, in a way, almost you don't want to make any deep moves in East Asia. Um, I think more could have been done in terms of Central Asian infrastructure, but I don't think we know the politics of this. I don't know, and I don't think anyone in the West knows, unless they have access to intelligence, what the constraints Russia puts on China are with regard to what's an acceptable, say, pipeline or deal in Central Asia. And again, if you put a pipeline through Xinjiang, in a way, that's the most unreliable part of China. There was a real terrorism problem, which led to this really deep and deep and thorough and totalitarian counter reaction and oppression by China. So let's say that they are now confident that that infrastructure there could be protected. Um, it's not clear. It's not clear whether Russia would be very happy with them building pipelines to, Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan. And it's not clear the U.S. would have been very happy with them, say, building Central Asian pipelines to Iran. Now, why would the pipelines be important? I think the economic benefit could be cheaper oil, but again, the strategic benefit, the geopolitical hedge, would have been very important. For the US, perhaps it's possible to get rid of the Nord Stream pipeline, bringing gas from Russia to Germany. But it's really not possible to destroy a pipeline going through the center of Eurasia. So again, that's even something not just Russia would object to, because then the Chinese are buying Kazakh oil or Uzbek oil or Iranian oil rather than Russian oil. It's even something the U.S. might object to before it's complete. So economically, I think the only thing they could have done is invest even more in automation, in AI, in science, in technology, but how much bang for buck they get out of research, that's been sort of a topic we've discussed on previous and I'm sure future episodes. It's rather tricky to spend basically R&D in ways that will grow the national economy.
Yeah, well articulated. Gearing towards wrapping up here, Alibaba, is there something that you find particularly impressive that we've not yet covered, or what would you say about, or close us out in terms of its future and what to expect given the circumstances?
Hmm. I mean, one of the things to consider is that the recent CEO, Eddie Wu, wrote this big memo to employees on the importance of AI. Basically, he says, if we don't keep up with the changes of the AI era, we will be displaced. Right? That's like a very weighty and direct statement coming from a Chinese CEO. But the reality is that, the drive to, say, increase sales of Alibaba Cloud, which Tsai claims run half of AI models in China, have been kind of disappointing, and their previous forays into R&D software produced relatively little. There was an Alibaba artificial intelligence laboratory established in 2016 that was just shut down. That was shut down in 2019. After just basically producing a bunch of Internet of Things products, right? So they don't have a strong history in AI. If the CEO says, if we don't adapt to the AI era, we will be displaced, it's actually quite possible that they will be displaced. They won't be displaced by a Western competitor, but they might actually be displaced by a Chinese competitor, right? I think that the biggest question for Alibaba's future, it's not going to be related to AI innovation. It's not going to come out of Alibaba. It'll be its relationship with the Ant Group. Alibaba and the Ant Group were closely together, basically one organization. It was kind of a legal fiction that the two were split up. But after they removed Jack Ma, they've undergone numerous reorganizations and restructuring. As Ma's influence waned, the legal fiction of the company's separation has become real. In other words, Alibaba and the Ant Group have had a failure of succession, and to be concrete, a failure not necessarily of knowledge succession. The current CEO might be quite competent, but the other component of succession, which is power succession, these two units that worked together so well, China's Amazon and China's PayPal, now drift apart. A bureaucratic reality became real, and the current CEO of Alibaba can't really tell Ant Group what to do, and vice versa. The government further might engage in divide and conquer and push the companies even further apart, breaking up the cliques that span multiple organizations. What do I mean by cliques? There was a lot of cross-hiring between Ant Group and Alibaba. This is sort of the connective tissue that kept the companies together, even if the leadership was formally separated. So, whether together or separate, I think neither Alibaba nor Ant Group face any short-term threats to their profitability. I would predict that in the medium run, Alibaba will see its market share shrink in online shipping because the competition and honestly the market conditions in China are amazing. Like they still have very cutthroat capitalism at play at these small and medium levels. It's just once you hit the scale of like maybe you're relevant to government economic decisions, that's when you get slapped down. But on this scale, nothing stops someone from creating a Chinese startup, doing a better job than Alibaba and gaining market share. The government will not protect Alibaba, right? So that is good for the economy. It means that you're not picking winners and losers, and more efficient companies can come in. But it just means that it's a young dead player. Now, we usually talk about dead players. We talk about companies like, I don't know, IBM, right? Companies that have been around for so long. And here we have an unusual situation where the live player in charge of a company, pushed out by the government, and then a relatively young, still highly functional company that actually has great business fundamentals, is not going to be able to adapt to its changes, to the changes in the economy. Now, Alibaba is more at risk here than Ant Group. Its position's more stable. Its core product, Alipay, is part of this duopoly that has protected by a very strong network effect. So competitors would have a harder time breaking into that market. And indeed, Ant Group might be protected by regulators. That's plausible because China is very worried about its financial system. Something that I should have mentioned earlier, why was critique of the financial system by Jack Ma so dangerous? Well, you probably hear all of these stories over and over again about how China is about to have a financial meltdown. Like you hear this every few years. They are putting out financial fires all over the place. And they have to be bullish, especially when those fires are quite serious fires, like stuff related to the real estate market and so on. The Chinese financial system is different than the West and has difficulty dealing with some problems that are routine for the West. On the other hand, it can resolve financial crises with mechanisms that we don't have here. It would be quite funny if the Chinese Communist Party were to lose power because of a massive financial crisis within China, impoverishing many millions that were once in the middle class. But I don't think Xi Jinping would laugh at that punchline.
Right. Yeah, and it's a tragedy that Alibaba has neither the live player, in that they're neither a live player because they're not a founder controlled company, but they don't have the protections of government either. So you have the worst of
They
both
have the
worlds.
worst of both worlds. Yeah. But in the short run, at least, still profitable. In the medium run, Alibaba is going to probably be outcompeted.
Yeah. Well, on that note, this has been a great discussion as always, Samo. Until next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.